years of ministerial experience across a range of complex and challenging portfolios, ranging from financial services to bringing together all the Commonwealth payments, transfer payments mechanisms under the Department of Human Services, and winding up with the toughest political sales job anyone's ever probably been handed, which was trying to rescue something out of work choices. He has worked hard through the period of opposition to develop a sense of the right direction for Australia's future, of what he wanted to do with the Treasury job, and it is striking that elected from September last year, he has absolutely hit the ground running, has been an impressive performer in Parliament, has had complete grasp of the issues, has been prepared to take tough decisions, and I think, unlike many parliamentary colleagues on either side of the of politics, has not allowed the burdens of office to suppress his sense of humour and humanity, which is something that we all enjoy. I think one of his great contributions, though, has been as an articulator of the vision that has characterised the Abbott government, and so I ask you to warmly welcome Joe to give us perhaps a little more taste of that vision. So thank you.
Thanks very much. Thanks. Thank you so much, David, and to all of you, ladies and gentlemen, particularly to Deborah Cobb-Clark, thank you as well for co-hosting with the Australian newspaper this important conference. This year, of course, marks the 50th anniversary of the Australian newspaper. And as someone who I'm pretty proud to say is not yet 50 years old, I have particularly enjoyed the Australians' republishing of stories from key events from the last half-century, covering everything from the turmoil in Indochina to the disappearance of Harold Holt. Reading newspaper clippings and remembering these events has helped reinforce the point that decisions that we make today always influence the events of tomorrow. And Australians in 1964 would not have been able to fathom the world that we currently live in. 50 years ago, governments had enormous influence over every aspect of society, from censorship of the press to the exchange of money. There were high tariff and non-tariff barriers to trade, and the government controlled the deposit and lending rates offered by predominantly government-owned banks. In 1964, job security was effectively guaranteed, with an unemployment rate of around 1%. Prosperity was almost taken for granted, and whilst geopolitical tensions, most significantly the Cold War, and significant social change were creating some community anxiety, there was a reassuring confidence around the growth of the economy. I believe that we stand at the dawn of another great age of prosperity, but it's a very different epoch to what anyone would have imagined in 1964. Back then, our biggest exports were wool, wheat, beef and veal. Today, our biggest exports are iron ore, coal, education and natural gas. In fact, today we export the equivalent, annual equivalent, of 30 tonnes of iron ore for every man, every woman and every child in Australia. An inconceivable achievement 50 years ago. Of course, back then we had strong and seemingly unbreakable ties with the United Kingdom, which was not only our largest trading partner, but also our largest source country for immigration. Today, our ties with Asia are much deeper. China and Japan are our largest trading partners, and India is our biggest source for immigrants. And an Australian in 1964 would not have fathomed that our news, our work, our interactions with others would be done to a large extent through a globally interconnected network of mobile phones and computers. And of course, newspapers understand this information revolution better than most. Given this immense change in the last 50 years, what can we say with any degree of certainty about the next 50 years? The truth is, the new disruptive forces in our world, in particular new technology and truly globally accessible markets, make it incredibly difficult, if not impossible, to predict the future. Governments are expected to prepare nations for the future with less certainty and less control of the future than at any other time in the history of humanity. We and the community more generally must accept that the role of government in people's lives is changing. We cannot pretend that governing a country in 2014 is the same as it once was, nor can we shape laws and policies based on a wistful longing for the good old days. We must prepare for tomorrow. Today's citizens are less trustful of the government and more truthful about their own destiny. They don't want government to dominate their lives. They want more control of their own lives, and it is the government's responsibility to help them gain that control. Therefore, the primary role of modern government is to strengthen personal empowerment by reducing the influence of centralised control. For example, more regulation and higher taxes strengthen the state and weaken the individual. And we want a more deregulated and highly competitive world. And the new role of government is to prepare policy that facilitates personal empowerment. We must prepare our people now, more than ever, for their deep engagement with the global community. Through better education, better technology and better infrastructure, our citizens, individually and collectively, must be able to achieve their best. I am prepared to back Australians in the global race. We are an innovative people with a deep respect for tradition, but a fearless optimism about the future. We work hard and we embrace change. To quote our unique vernacular, we are prepared to have a go, provided that we get a fair go. As a result of this new environment, our community will be richer and our people more prosperous. And we will be able to provide the support services for those most in need on a more generous and sustainable basis than ever before. That is the community dividend associated with change and reform. So we must prepare now. Our public policies must prepare us for what may lie ahead, because whatever the future brings, it will come to us much faster than we expect. As a result, the coalition government has begun preparing Australia to meet head-on and beat the many challenges we will confront over the next 50 years. Our plan for Australia prepares us for many futures, all of which will rely entirely on the effort and enterprise of the empowered individual in a highly competitive world. Since coming to office just over 9 months ago, we've reduced the debt burden on future generations by getting the budget back in order and laying down plans that allow us to live within our means. By making the tough decisions now, we will free up future generations to react to the challenges they will face without being hamstrung, paying off the debt racked up over the last few years. Our budget goes a long way to achieve this, by slashing projected government debt by almost $300 billion over the next decade, saving $16 billion in interest payments per year by that time. This is even after prudently allowing for future tax relief. We want to reduce the amount Australian taxpayers spend on interest and ensure more of their taxpayer dollar is spent on the delivery of frontline services. The Commission of Audit, released in early May, showed that without action, government would simply continue to become a bigger and more influential part of our lives, with the funding for this either being raised through more taxes or more debt, which is, of course, future tax increases. The budget highlighted how important it is to draw a line in the sand and get government spending back on a sustainable track. The benefit of making these decisions now is that in the years ahead, we will be able to afford a sustainable quality of life in a far more competitive world. By borrowing money today, we are asking our children to pay for our current lifestyle when they have to repay the debt with interest in the future. We consider that unfair. The Coalition is determined to reduce the role of government in people's lives by better targeting spending and by reducing the overall burden of taxation below what it would otherwise be. The first word is the abolition of the carbon tax. This will save the average Australian household around $550 this year alone. And we're getting rid of the mining tax, which has raised just 3% of its intended revenue. And it saves the budget $13 billion by getting rid of most of its unfunded associated expenditure. These taxes have acted like sand in the wheels of the economy. We will strengthen economic growth and encourage new investment by abolishing these totemic public policy failures. At the same time, we are building greater simplicity and more robust integrity in our tax system. As chair of the G20, we are working with our international colleagues to address the global issue of tax base erosion. We need a global solution to a global problem of profit shifting and tax base erosion. By the end of this year, I expect to see some positive global initiatives coming out of the work by the OECD for the G20 finance ministers and the G20 leaders, and also work undertaken by our own Commissioner of Taxation to facilitate greater information sharing about the activities of companies that do not pay a fair level of tax where they earn income. Domestically, we are ensuring the structural integrity of our tax system by proceeding with deliverable thin capitalisation changes. The initial program announced by the previous government last year was flawed. However, with some changes to the package that do not harm Australian businesses, we can limit the ability to shift profits out of Australia by the allocation of excessive debt to Australian operations. These changes will be introduced into Parliament in July. To prepare for many futures, we need the infrastructure that facilitates growth and lowers the cost of competing. We are kick-starting the non-mining sector of the economy by facilitating the building of $125 billion of productivity-enhancing infrastructure across Australia over the next decade. This investment will boost economic growth and jobs today. It will lower business costs and improve the quality of life by easing congestion. It will also increase the productive capital of the economy and raise the speed limit to growth in the future. Productive infrastructure for our economy is an investment in our future, and I know that the Prime Minister and the Minister for Communications will talk about this later during the day. But if we are to borrow today, it is essential that we at least leave some identifiable benefits for future generations. Better infrastructure is a step in the right direction. We must prepare our citizens for the work environment of the future. We want to lift workforce participation through work for the dole, changes to the social security safety net and incentive payments to get our older Australians back into work. It's good news that some of these reforms have started this week, and it builds on our collective efforts in the first 5 months of the year to generate an environment that has created 100,000 full-time jobs across the economy. However, there have been challenges. We've inherited rising unemployment and certainly a more regulated workplace. As a result, and to prepare for the future, we are undertaking modest but significant workplace reform, including reintroducing the Australian Building and Construction Commission. And given that we do need to increase workforce participation, we have initiatives such as a fair income paid parental leave scheme that ensures people can still balance family duties with commercial obligations. Now, I understand that Mr Daly spoke to you a little bit earlier. Well, according to the Grattan Institute, if Australian women did as much paid work as the women in Canada, Australia's GDP would be about $25 billion higher than it is today. But let's face the reality. Unlike our parents, our generation and those that follow will not be able to afford a home in a capital city on just one household income. Self-evidently, the mortgage still comes in whether you are on parental leave or not. We need Australians to work, but we also need Australians to have more children. And the best way to encourage that is to give them confidence, a sense of income security during the high-cost days of raising a family. Our social safety net must be better prepared for the future as well. This financial year, taxpayers will spend $146 billion on social security and welfare, just over $6,000 for every man, woman and child in Australia. Our current system of welfare payments is too complex and just too difficult to navigate. There are around 20 income support payments, 55 supplementary payments and several tax concessions. There's also a range of other government services, including subsidised medicines and health services, subsidised education and training, and subsidised access to public facilities. As a society, we have a social and moral duty to provide for those who cannot provide for themselves. That's without dispute. However, to ensure that the welfare system is sustainable, we must ensure it targets assistance to those who need it most and that it encourages those who can lift themselves back up through either work or study. The changes to the welfare system in this year's budget are a first step toward making the system sustainable. But there are significant gains to be made in the way that welfare support is delivered. The current system is outdated and it has limited flexibility and efficiency. Assistance and requirements are often based on payment category rather than the capability or needs of individuals. It's not easy to work out the precise mix of payments and services which would suit each person, each case, and it's not easy to see the total package that each individual receives. We need a major reform effort to develop suitable information technology infrastructure that increases the efficiency, flexibility and transparency of the system and delivers precisely tailored assistance to meet individual requirements. We also need a sustainable health system that can deliver the treatment and cures for the fastest growing and most malevolent chronic diseases of the future. That's why we are investing in the future health of our nation by creating a growing pool of funds for new medical research. Savings from the health budget and the modest $7 co-payment will contribute to the invested fund that is going to build that new solution. And we need an education system that best prepares our citizens for the future. We have started the process of university deregulation that will allow Australian universities to compete unshackled with their counterparts around the world. Our reforms will mean that better and more appropriate courses will be offered to more people at a price which reflects the economic value of the course. There is a very strong link between the level of education and outcomes for employment and income, and this government wants to create an environment where all Australians have more choices about the investment that they can make in their own future, empowering students and individuals. And we are supporting more courses at more institutions, including sub-bachelor courses at TAFE. It will help build a higher skilled workforce with a greater capacity to build a better and brighter future. But our reforms go beyond the student. It's also about building specialist skills at appropriate universities, from medical research at hospital-linked campuses to new tropical science research at our northern universities. And to build a better future, we need to open new markets. The Abbott government has strengthened our relationship with our Asian neighbours through closer collaboration on trade, investment and education. Our strong push to finalise free trade agreements with Korea, Japan, and I'm very hopeful with China, will build on the increasing internationalisation of commerce. We are determined to broaden our business opportunities across Asia, from resources and energy to agriculture and agribusiness, from services sectors such as health and medical research to financial services, tourism and aged care. These initiatives will also provide opportunities for international businesses to expand in the Australian market. This means more jobs and a more competitive market for consumers. The coalition government is using our presidency of the G20 to promote strong growth initiatives with the ambition of collectively lifting global economic output by an additional 2% over the next 5 years. This was a declaration that we made at the Finance Ministers' meeting in Sydney. This will add more than $2 trillion to the world economy and create tens of millions of new jobs around the world. We are driving this agenda hard because, as a medium-sized open economy that produces much more in goods than we consume, what is good for the world economy is good for the Australian economy. It is part of an economic action strategy that will build a stronger economic future and create prosperity. But to be at our best, to take advantage of the future, our policy platform must reach beyond the budget. Accordingly, our upcoming policy work on the federation, the taxation system, workplace laws, the financial system and competition policy will help lay down an agenda for growth and further improve the productive capacity of the nation. These methodical reviews of the vital economic structures will stand Australia in good stead for the next century. I remain very positive about Australia's future, notwithstanding the challenges of the present, the burdens of the past. We live in the fastest growing region in the world, and for the first time in our history, our geographical location is a great advantage. And our massive natural advantages in agriculture, resources and energy will, with some reasonable effort, continue to provide a sound base for future prosperity. It remains the case that the massive growing middle classes in China and India, Indonesia and Southeast Asia will want what we have, from good quality health and aged care to a corruption-free legal system and a safe and secure community. They'll want clean air, they'll want clean water, and they want better housing. They will seek out a quality of life that Australians have never taken for granted. Well, we can take advantage of this demand. Australia has much to offer: a vibrant tourism sector, sophisticated financial and wealth management industry, safe and secure energy supplies and a stable political environment. Through e-commerce in particular, I want Australia and Australian businesses to be a key part of meeting the growing demands of the emerging Asian middle class. China alone, as you know, and I don't need to say it to so many here that have participated in China for such a long period of time, but China alone continues to represent a massive growth opportunity for our nation. With over 600 million internet users, 80% of whom access the web via their smartphones. Chinese citizens will be empowered to engage in commerce on a scale never previously imagined. And the growth will continue, with some 400 million smartphones to be sold in China this year alone, accounting for nearly a third of all smartphone sales globally. China has already become the world's second largest e-commerce market. These middle-class consumers are already using the internet to seek out the best products in the world. The rise of e-commerce has fundamentally boosted the forces of competition and increased consumer sovereignty. Consumers can now shop for the best products at the best prices anywhere in the world. This has led to what the chief economist at Google, Hal Varian, has termed the micro-multinational, small companies that operate globally. And while that means that the tailor in Bondi is now competing with the tailor in Bangalore, it also means that the picture framer in St Kilda now has the option of purchasing materials direct from a manufacturer in Shanghai. Businesses are now much more global in operation and in some ways are beyond the control of any single sovereign government. The pace of change has dramatically accelerated, and that's fantastic. Consumers, not governments, have redefined commerce and markets, so it is obvious that we must respond appropriately with laws and policies that facilitate change rather than hamper or impede or try to control change. We know that governments will not help the progress towards a brighter future by looking in the rear-view mirror and trying to roll back the clock to policies of the past. And we know that paternalistic, interventionist governance is the wrong model of government in an ever-changing and unpredictable world. And this has been reflected in our approach to industry assistance requests. And they've come out of hard decisions, but they're the right decisions and they're consistent decisions. And it's been reflected in our determination to cut red tape and to speed up environmental approvals. And it's been reflected in our approach to government finances. Governments and regulators, many in my own portfolio, must adopt a new mindset which facilitates change and reform that ultimately is driven by demands from the community rather than the dictates of an intrusive government. Resisting reform will inevitably mean that political attitudes and governance structures get left behind and become increasingly irrelevant. Just as there is no limitation on human aspiration, there is no finishing line on change and reform. So, David, I say to you, as your newspaper has done over the last few weeks, Australians should remember our past and celebrate our success. The lessons of yesterday endure today. We must earn prosperity, and we cannot take our future for granted. And we know that the pace of change will speed up. It's not going to slow down. So we recognise that many of the changes arising from increased globalisation, new technology and increased power for the consumer are outside the direct control of government. We welcome that. But it also means that the role of government must be different so that we can facilitate change and not stand in its way. The new coalition government has begun to redefine the role of government in people's lives so that the community can have more direct control over the nation's prosperous future. We will strengthen the safety nets and we will build better infrastructure, but we will also reduce our control of people's lives by reducing regulation and giving Australians more control of their own finances. The work has started, but there's much work to be done. With an end to the age of entitlement comes a new age of opportunity. This is when Australians can be at their best. The policy work to be future ready has started. There's still much work to be done. We stand ready to do it. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Treasurer's happy to take some questions, and I thought I would exercise the prerogative of the chair in asking the first one. The world is awash with liquidity at the moment, and you can see the effects of that in bond and share prices hitting new peaks, notwithstanding the fact that the world economy is, as we heard this morning, forecasts of growth are being continually downgraded. Is there a mispricing of risk going on at a global level, and what are the implications of that for Australia?
Well, the world is awash with liquidity, there's no doubt about that, and people are searching everywhere for yields. I'm always reluctant to pass comment on the market because the market is the market. Having said that, it seems a little odd that the Spanish government can borrow at lower interest rates than the US government in this current environment. And quite clearly there are warning signs. If there are events that would cause longer term rates to go up, then there might be a bit of a race for the door out of a number of traders and investors. But overwhelmingly, David, now's the time for governments to sell the assets and take the money out of that capital and put it into new productive assets. And the prices that we can achieve for our assets today are much better than they may be tomorrow. And here I am in Victoria and just look at the prices achieved for electricity assets here. Well, I've done everything I can, including laying down a $5 billion asset recycling fund for my state colleagues and selling assets ourselves so that we can take our money out of assets where the government balance sheet is comparatively lazy and start investing in productive assets that are going to build the infrastructure for a stronger economy. And that's exactly what we are doing. That is what we are facilitating. And whilst there seems to be some predictably extraordinary behaviour in global capital markets, we've got to focus on the medium and long term in the way that we run our own budgets, and that's what we're doing.
So, questions?
Treasurer, John Daly from Grattan Institute, you were kind enough to refer to our work on female workforce participation, and indeed it is a potentially very large contributor to Australian economic growth. But the same report that you referred to also pointed out that for every dollar that government spends on paid parental leave, you would get double the impact on female workforce participation if you spend it on childcare. And we can see that in Australia, essentially women on middle incomes have very little financial incentive to work more than 3 days a week because their take-home pay after you've taken out tax and given up welfare and paid for childcare means they take home very little if they work for more than 3 days a week. So in straitened budget times, you don't have a lot of money to spend. Wouldn't you be better off spending any additional money from a company levy or wherever else on reducing the effective cost of childcare so that parents could take home a bit more of their pay packet rather than spending it on paid parental leave?
Well, it's got to be a mix of both, John. I'll treat that as Dorothy Dixer. You've got to have a mix of both. As the Australian newspaper knows, obviously it's seen the Productivity Commission, or might have had a hint of the Productivity Commission report on childcare coming. I haven't received that report yet, which is interesting, isn't it? But you need greater flexibility in childcare. My electorate in North Sydney has, I think, amongst the highest and most expensive childcare in Australia. Part of that is associated with the high cost of real estate to provide that childcare. But also, the previous government had a massive new wave of regulation of childcare, which, in the end of the day, reduced the flexibility of the childcare that is provided. So there are many factors, and I know Susan Lee is speaking a little bit later, and I'm not going to preempt what she says, but it's got to be a combination of both. Can I say something about paid parental leave? Because I know there are a number of people who are critics in this place. Right? I want to say this emphatically about paid parental leave. I grew up in a small business family, and my parents couldn't afford to pay paid parental leave to the receptionist or the young woman that came to work. And my father had to endure a turnover of staff that went off to the public service to get paid parental leave, or went to a big business to get paid parental leave when he couldn't afford to do it. And hardly any small businesses in Australia can afford to pay it. For the first time, we are putting them on the same level playing field as big business. For the first time, we're putting them on the same level playing field as the public service. For the first time, and one of the fastest growing areas of micro business in Australia is women setting up their own home-based business. For the first time, they are not going to be financially penalised for housebound duties and lose the opportunities associated with their growth of their micro business as a result of our paid parental leave scheme. Because for the first time, we recognise that people should not be financially penalised. And as I pointed out in this speech, I mean, try living in any capital city in Australia on just one household income. It's nigh impossible, but the mortgage still keeps coming in and the bills still keep coming in. So there is a financial penalty associated with childbirth on a scale that my mum never had and others of that generation never had. They had different challenges. I totally recognise that. But the financial challenges today for an everyday household are far more complicated, necessarily because of the advent of time. So for the first time, we are giving women the very same opportunity as men. For the first time, we are giving small business the very same opportunity as big business and the public service. And I see that as a great outcome, and that's without compromising our commitment in any way to childcare.
Michael?
Treasurer, lots of ideas. Why don't you take a look at the tertiary education sector, which if Jeff Kennett looked at, there's a bunch of intellectual power stations. I think he'd say let's invest their assets, close down the Commonwealth Department of Education and allow education institutions globally to do their thing. If it fits with your philosophy, it's financially responsible, it's practical, why don't we do something like that?
Well, I don't fear competition. And we shouldn't fear competition. Australians are at their best when they're in a competitive environment, be it in tennis, or be it in business, or be it in any particular field. We can compete with the best and beat them. So why don't we want to do it in higher education? Why do we need to have a regulated environment? Why not allow our people to be their best, allow our institutions to be our best? And as for the assets, I mean, look at the competition that is emerging out of massive campuses in Asia as a starting point. Campuses with 250,000 students, with a financial muscle that can become a honeypot for the best academics in the world. And you know, I mean, as a student, I went to Sydney University. I want my university to be recognised as the best in the world because it enhances my career prospects all over the world, because labour is more mobile than it's ever been. Our children are more likely to work overseas and wave around their degree from their alma mater, more likely to do that than we ever did. And so we want to have reputational advantage, and that's why our campuses need to be better. But they've been hamstrung by regulation. They've got a speed limiter on their capacity. And at the same time as we are putting in place that speed limiter on our tertiary institutions, we are also limiting our ability to help those people who might not get to university but who want to undertake TAFE courses or undertake an apprenticeship. We are limiting our ability to help them because we are lifting the handbrake on our tertiary institutions. So it is a combination. Our reforms in the budget are about preparing Australian educational institutions for the future. That's what we're about.
You're still open them. Set them free.
Well, I think we're trying to set them free. We're trying to set them free. We're trying to set them free.
Paul.
Treasurer, you've spoken with a great passion about the government's agenda and its philosophy, but in public commentary there's a sense of pessimism and uncertainty about the government's capacity to actually legislate its budget, and as you know, very significant elements of the budget, more so than anything we've seen for a number of decades, are now in serious jeopardy. I wonder if you could tell the audience what your assessment is of the government's ability to get most of the budget through and how it intends to do that. And related to that, possibly in the transition you talk about from the age of entitlement to the age of opportunity, to what extent that you've been caught here on the issue of fairness, which has been put up in lights as the main critique of the budget?
Well, the fairest thing we can do is prepare Australia for the future. In fact, the fairest thing we can do is prepare Australia for many different futures, none of which we can predict. But we know that if we strengthen our capacity as a nation, if we improve our productivity, if we improve the capacity of individuals to excel, we know that our future can be bright. We're in the right time zone, the rest of the world wants what we have, and thankfully they don't want to invade us to get it. This is a terrific moment in history, but we can't sit back on our heels. We can't be lazy about it. And reform, you've got to fight for it, but you've also you've got to recognise that, you know, under previous treasurers and previous governments, the government would say, look, we've got to do this, we must do that in order to, you know, change the way we behave. But what's happening is the community is changing the way we behave, and government has to, in a sense, react to that, lift the constraints off of higher tax and more regulation, and allow the community to achieve its best. So what is one of the key drivers of reform? Well, globalisation is a key driver of reform. But instead of all wisdom coming out of Canberra, out of Parliament House Canberra, wisdom is coming from the community. In a sense, we've got to take them with us, and we've got to allow them to encourage us to come along. And in part, that is the answer in the Senate. I mean, the Senate is, I would like to think, of a centre-right persuasion. And ultimately, the people sitting in the middle are the ones that are going to see common sense. But they need to be predictable, and they need to be consistent to their values. And I think it's a good thing for political parties to restate their values. I'd like the Greens, for example, to restate their values on reducing carbon emissions, or I'd like the Greens to restate their principles on increasing taxes on fuel, or the Labor Party to restate whatever principles it holds today. I mean, I'd like individuals to state their principles, and if they do that, if they declare what they believe in, as I think a number of Palmer United and also a number of the other independents in the Senate have started to do, then we will get greater clarity about what in the budget is going to pass. Now, I'm not the advantage that David talked about of having been around a while. It took Peter Costello a long time to get some of his initiatives through the Senate. In fact, I dug out one of his old, one of the stories from The Australian, actually, about how he was quite frustrated that a number of education reforms were struggling to get through the Senate in 1997. Well, we just brought down the budget. It's barely been out there for 2 months. People shouldn't write it off. And the second thing is, there are always other ways that we can get some of that reform happening. For example, well, there are other ways we can. We believe the best policy path is the one that we've laid down, and we would hope that our friends in the Senate would see that. You nearly got me.
Yeah. Down the back. Is that more? I can quite see from here.
Treasurer Hockey, Rory Robertson, Westpac Treasury. In the previous session, people like John Daly and Judith Sloan expressed a lot of anxiety about the rapid growth in health spending and the worry about how we could get it under control. Obviously, the main way we could get it under control is if somehow we could control, reverse the obesity and diabetes epidemics that are global. As you mentioned, getting those things under control, getting obesity and diabetes under control, it's the greatest public health challenge of our time. I've got a theory that says if the Treasurer, and your Treasury Department took over health policy, there'd be a real chance of that happening, in that I think the economists at Treasury are excellent with...
That'd be an early grave for me, Rory. I think
no, on the contrary,
sure
sir.
That the days are numbered.
Economists are good at evidence-based policy, and so I guess I would encourage you to get some of your people to look at the science of metabolic syndrome, which is a simple thing that basically says, the indicators of obesity and heart disease and diabetes are I won't go, but they're high blood pressure, high triglycerides, high blood glucose, low HDL cholesterol, all those things. That's a pretty uncontroversial modern science.
Okay.
But the dietary implications are profound in that low-carb diets are seen to fix it and high-carb diets are seen to hurt it. And
Okay. I get the message.
So the question is just, could we have a national conversation about dietary policy in Australia, high carb versus low carb? It's important. We're all struggling with our girth. Pretty well most of us in the room. Thank you, sir.
The irony is, I went to a research facility in Concord in Sydney, and had a number of presentations from eminent scientists and researchers and medical researchers. And after a survey of 1,200, they found that having a high-protein, low-carb diet was going to give you a better quality of life, which is, it turns some medical research on its head. But the overwhelming message I got was actually if we delay the ageing process, that is the best way to improve the overall health of the general community. And through medical research, we can delay the ageing process. And Australia is actually making great strides in this area. But one of the things we have failed to do, even though over time we're going to get to an average spending at the moment of around $1 billion a year on medical research, is we are failing to implement the clinical trials and failing to commercialise adequately some of the great research initiatives we have in medicine. So our initiative in building the biggest medical research endowment fund in the world, which in perpetuity doubles the medical research budget in Australia and guarantees that future governments aren't going to chop and change the base funding for medical research. That in turn, which then will help to facilitate clinical trials, which will help to facilitate, at the end of the day, commercialisation of Australian medical breakthroughs, will in turn reduce the costs of the medical system, because we have the capacity to find the cures for the diseases that are going to afflict our nation in the future and afflict our nation today. And obesity is one of them, but there are many things. I mean, the mortality rate associated with brain cancer is truly, truly grave. And from my perspective, I mean, Charlie Teo is a great mate of mine, and he's one of the people that, you know, has convinced me how important our Medical Research Endowment Fund will be for the future of medical research in Australia and also for our development as a medical research centre. I mean, we keep looking at Silicon Valley for IT, but by God, we can have the equivalent of Silicon Valley for medical research here in Australia. We've just got to have a go, and we've got to fund it. And we haven't got the recurrent expenditure to fund it, but we are asking everyday Australians to contribute. When they go and visit a doctor in the same way they do with the PBS, that in turn will help us to build a better quality of life through the health system over the future.
Yeah.
Nassim Kadem from the Financial Review. Please don't hold it against me that I'm not from the Australian. My question is about the Commonwealth Bank financial planning scandal. As you know, they've announced the compensation today for the victims. Given your mother-in-law was one of the victims, I'd be interested in your view. And also, they've opened it up for the past decade that now all their advice can be reviewed. Do you think that this will open them up to massive compensation claims?
Look, because my mother-in-law was involved, I've stayed out of the matter appropriately, and Matthias Cormann has done an outstanding job handling a very difficult issue. Clearly, the Commonwealth Bank was just too slow to get to this point. Clearly. And a lot of the anxiety could have been averted if they had moved more quickly. But I do recognise that they've apologised, and that's a good... Firstly, you've got to recognise the problem exists. And for a long period there was denial. The second thing is you've got to, show appropriate contrition for what happened, and now they've done that. The third thing is you've got to have a plan to ensure that people are given appropriate compensation. They're starting to do that, but there's obviously a way to go. But this is one institution. I don't think it is systemic, and it is best to ensure that integrity issues are ultimately going to be in the hands of shareholders and customers of the Commonwealth Bank and people who have been affected by their previous financial advice. I'm not qualified to comment on that.
Last question?
Sid.
Sid.
He wants equal billing with the Financial Review.
Mr Hockey, I felt you were on the verge of telling us something a second ago, and I just had to give you another opportunity to get it off your chest. You were saying there are other ways of doing things if the Senate blocks some of the budget measures. Could you, is Section 96 of the Constitution one way? Can you regulate to do some of your budget initiatives if the Senate won't pass legislation? Could you unpack that for us a little bit?
Well, Sid, the starting point is some of the biggest savings initiatives are not subject to new legislation. For example, foreign aid. The reduction in the growth of foreign aid is one of our bigger long-term savings. Secondly, changes in the funding arrangements with the states, even though they get more over the next 4 years, by the way, which might have been lost in all those newspaper ads that they put out. But anyway, so the fact is that there are reductions in government expenditure where it can be undertaken. The structural reform that we've put in place only happens in a small number of cases immediately through legislation, such as the increase in the excise on fuel, which, by the way, I mean, if the Greens hold out on that, it'd be truly absurd. I mean, the Greens are playing politics instead of showing any principle, and no wonder their base is in uproar. I mean, it is extraordinary. And I'll have more to say about that over the next few weeks and months. But certainly in relation to structural change in welfare, a number of those initiatives don't start immediately. Also in relation to the health system, the changes don't start immediately. In relation to the asset recycling program, we are not going to let the Labor Party's politics hold us back. And we will still appropriate to the states the funding necessary for the asset recycling program, because we need to start building now. We need to get on with the asset sales and the asset construction now. And we tried to set up an appropriate process to do that, but Labor and the Greens and everyone else wants to have their $2 worth. Well, we'll keep putting that up to the Senate to have an appropriate process, but there is a second option, and that is to appropriate to the states, and we will do that because we have to build the infrastructure. As you know, the investment in mining construction has come off enormously. And, you know, this morning the Reserve Bank Governor in Hobart further identified that as a challenge for the economy. So, as David knows, mining investment was driving a huge amount of growth in the Australian economy. That's predictably come off. We've gone into the mining production and export phase. Fantastic, fantastic. But the other 90% of the economy needs to be lifted. The other 98% of employment needs to be lifted. And the way to do that is to build infrastructure fast. Now, the federal government doesn't own a construction company. We work in partnership with the states. They've got the planning powers. They've got the environmental approvals. And they've also got the plans and resources to roll it out. We are laying on the table the biggest incentive program, I would argue more so than national competition policy, but one that is changing the shape of infrastructure in Australia. $5 billion on the table now. I'll give them 15% of the net proceeds of any sale they have, that they then go and put into new productive infrastructure, which in turn may well be seed capital for private investment. And as I've said before, the world is awash with money at the moment. Governments are not, but the world is. And what we've got to do is get things moving. And the best way to do that is not to have various handbrakes in the Senate being pulled for political purposes, but simply to keep driving to make sure that we do get a growth agenda and job agenda through. Now, it may take more than one occasion for us to try and get things through. And as I said, if you look at budgets passed, it's taken time to get things through. But we will not waver in our determination to get the best policies through the Parliament to deliver the growth and jobs agenda that Australia sorely needs. Thanks very much.